Why Media Group? The fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome to Y Media Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and a new Hill Times analysis, this is very critical, reveals that 11 parliamentary committees chose not to review approximately $128.6 billion in planned federal spending, including nearly $50 billion earmarked for defense, national defense. This is raising concerns about parliamentary oversight and accountability. The finding comes as Ottawa embarks on a major spending increase in defense. We know that it went from 1.4% of GDP to 2%. It's planning in about 3.5 years to hit the 4% mark of GDP. And so Ottawa's major spending when it comes to defense, for infrastructure, AI, housing, and government operations, all of that is massive spending that's taking place right now. And so, under Canada's parliamentary system, the government spending proposals are referred to the House of Commons committees, right? So, the government says these are our projects, this is what we're going to invest in, this is how we're going to spend. And so, that goes to House of Commons committees for examination, right? And that happens before Parliament approves the funds. And so, this is important because committees supposed to review all the stuff, give their feedback, and then it goes to the House for voting. Now, these committees' reviews are intended to provide scrutiny, transparency, accountability over how taxpayer dollars are spent. But what's been found on this investigation is that committees do not conduct reviews within prescribed deadlines. Their spending requests are deemed their spending requests are deemed reported back to the House without examination. And critics argue that this increasingly turns parliamentary oversight into what would be a procedural formality rather than a meaningful review of the process. So now the facts are finding that there's 11 committees that did not review their assigned spending estimates before the deadline. That's really big because this is taxpayer dollars that are going into what the government wants to spend on. And if you have oversight committees that are supposed to take a look at what these budgets are and how it's going to be spent, and when you have 11 committees, not just one or two, but 11 is quite a lot, saying that they did not showing that they did not meet their deadlines. They did not do their assigned spending estimates and reviews before the deadlines. And when you total what took place between these 11 committees, we're looking at approximately $128.6 billion of planned government spending going without any committee scrutiny, oversight, review, nothing, right? So roughly $50 billion of that amount involved national defense spending. The issue comes as Canada rapidly expands military spending as a NATO commitment. And so yet you have this, lack of oversight taking place. And so parliamentary experts and watchdog groups have repeatedly warned that the committees essentially they're missing their deadlines. It's also their workload. It's also the partisan gridlock, right? Whether it's conservative led, liberal led. Well, we know liberals have the majority. Are there enough NDPs? There's that entire partisan gridlock, and the time constraints are, weakening what should it be parliamentary reviews and abilities to scrutinize government spending. This is very critical because you have a total federal main estimate of, when it comes to the year of 2026 to 2027, $502.8 billion. Spending not reviewed by committee. So out of the $502 billion, you have $128.6 billion just not reviewed, representing at least 1/4 of all planned federal spending that has missed its deadlines and there is no oversight on. The national defense request, approximately 48.5 billion, so around about 50 billion, making it the largest voted spending item in the federal budget. And then you have this at the time where you have approximately 55% of voted appropriation received no committee reviews, oversight. And this is critical because the issue is not necessarily whether the spending itself is justified. It's essentially a concern whether Parliament properly performing its constitutional obligations and duties. I mean, they went into an election, they got their constituents' votes, they've been sworn in as MPs, they've been put into these committees. And so when they're not doing their oversight about how their constituents' money is being spent, the Canadian tax dollars being spent, this is very alarming because it's showing that, Parliament is not performing its constitutional role of holding the government accountable for public expenditures, right? So you can have Carney's, his office saying, we want to spend all this. He gets his ministers to say, yeah, this is what we're going to do. But then that goes to committee and that needs to be reviewed. There needs to be feedback. There needs to be oversight. So you have, a quarter of a year's worth of spending that just hasn't been reviewed and it's missed all of its deadlines. And so this is a time where also Ottawa is dramatically increasing its spending, right? We know that. We hear all the announcements. We see all of the ministers and their announcements of they're spending on AI, they're spending on the grid, they're spending on this, they're spending on that. So we know spending is happening, but are they making announcements on spending without committee oversight about how these dollars are going to be spent? Is it justifiable? What is the plan? So this is a time where you need better management. So you have, all of this happening without scrutiny. MPs have fewer opportunities to question officials, right? So if you have committee and they need to be able to question the minister's portfolio that's saying we're going to spend this much in my portfolio, right? Like $50 billion, defense minister, right? Are the MPs getting a chance to question and identify any waste on that budget? Are they able to challenge any assumptions on the minister's part or uncover any implementation risks and say, hey, here's a highlight, like what we just did, defense spending. What is its plan to get to make sure there's procurement procedures? How do smaller defense companies get to be able to bid? What is the timeline for any of those things? Those are all implementation risks that need to go through committee. So the story exposes, reading this on the broader problem in Canadian governance, right? You have Parliament spending enormous amount of money and enormous amount of time debating political controversies, but often is devoid of doing some of this critical work in committees where you have this them missing their deadlines on actual spending and what is the oversight for taxpayer dollars. The fact that over $128 billion could proceed without committee reviews does not mean the money's being misspent, but however, it does suggest that oversight mechanisms designed to protect taxpayer dollars and the oath that's given by MPs to have their constitutional duties is showing that it's something is not working here, right? Is there too much load of work on committees? What are their priorities? Why are they missing their deadlines? These are all massive concerns that the taxpayers are becoming aware of and are wondering how that's going to be met at a time where we're seeing all of these announcements on dollars being spent. And to that, well, there's another item that has been also debated in Parliament, and this is one that we've also spoken internally, which is the federal government is preparing a new online harms bill that could include a ban, and it sounds like it's almost there and it's almost done, on social media access for children or teenagers, young adults under the age of 16. And this proposal could make Canada one of the most aggressive jurisdictions in the world when it comes to youth social media restrictions. And that has followed similar moves, such as Australia did this. And there's growing pressure from parents, educators, and mental health advocates for this. So, what is this all about? You have Prime Minister Mark Carney is essentially rewriting Canada's online harms framework after previous legislations failed to pass before the 2025 election. This new approach is expected to focus heavily on child protection, cyberbullying, online exploitation, and AI generated harms, and social media access for minors. This idea has gained momentum following Australia's landmark decision to ban social media access for users under the age of 16. But after the Liberal Party members voted overwhelmingly in favor of a minimum age requirement of 16 for social media accounts and AI chatbots. So this is probably it's almost done. It's going to happen. There's been a lot of discussions around it. So Prime Minister Mark Carney has said that the issue deserves an open, considerable debate on it, and we've been debating this in media as well and very openly. But what does it mean, right? So right now the current rules on platforms are a minimum age of 13. And enforcement is often criticized as ineffective. So how do you enforce now changing the age from 13 to 16? And how do the social media companies enforce this? How do parents enforce this? How do the educators in school enforce this? When you have a cell phone and you take it to school with you and you have access to, all of this content and platforms, how do you restrict that? Right? Internally, we had a discussion of like, is there, a software where they're able to see, is this the right user? I mean, if I were to go open up an account and if I don't give my right birthday, right? Let's just say I'm 15 years old and I give my birthday that makes me, 20 years old. How would these social media firms know? How would Ottawa really implement this, right? So you have this happening at a time where, yes, there's concerns from parents, there's concerns from educators, mental health advocacies groups about why, to be able to protect children from social media. But it's also the question is, you could pass legislation, but um, how is that going to happen? Like, how is it going to be implemented? Of course, we're going to be giving you the latest details on when this is implemented and how, and it plans on making it an effective bill and a law in Canada. Now, there's something happening with the Liberal Party, which could trigger the opinion that there might still be maybe a general election that the prime minister may pull. Yes, we know he has his majority now in parliament, but this is also a very slim majority. We know already two of his MPs are resigning. And so now this is important because the Liberal Party has come up with a process of who's going to run for re-election and what are the criterias for their existing MPs. And some Liberal MPs are pushing that their party to extend their Labor Day deadline that requires incumbent MPs to meet nominational criterias well before the next federal election. So the question remains, when is the next federal election? Because if the federal election was last year and there's a mandate, to hold it, if it's a majority government, then it would be, in another 2.5 years would be the general election. So why would this year, September, Labor Day, be the deadline for MPs unless the Liberal Party's still thinking about perhaps it might trigger an election to be able to get more seats. This way, the prime minister says, hey, I've been at my job for a year and a half. This is what we've accomplished. This is what we've spent on. This is our strategy for future plans. I need a mandate. I need a super majority mandate, right? And that would trigger some of these things. If that's the case, then, it would trigger what's going to happen on the conservative side. Will they lose seats that they gained in the last general election? Or are they are they in a position to gain seats? They already lost four of their MPs crossing the floor. Will they lose some of the key battlegrounds in 905, York Region, some of the other key places that they were able to win under Pierre Poilievre? It's going to be very interesting. So what's happened here is that these Liberal MPs are pushing their party to extend the Labor Day deadline for requirements for their incumbent MPs to meet the nomination criteria to be a nominated candidate in a general election, right? Because even though they're an MP now, they still need to go through the nomination process to meet the criteria. Critics are saying within the caucus, Liberal caucus, are arguing that the timeline is too aggressive and it could create a disadvantage for MPs who are focused on parliamentary duties, whether they're a minister or their constituency work or rebuilding riding associations after the 2025 election. So earlier this year, the Liberal Party introduced a new nomination rules requiring incumbent MPs to satisfy certain organizational and fundraising conditions by Labor Day, right? So fundraising, what's their target? They must have a target of fundraising that they're bringing into the party. And if they want to protect themselves from a nomination challenge before the next election. So what that means is, if there's a fundraising criteria, right? Let's just say each MP, has to bring in $500,000. I'm just giving a roundabout, right? We're going to know the exact numbers later, and they're not able to meet those criterias, then what that means is they'll be challenged. So an MP, in Toronto Centre, for example, who should seek re-election and, should become the candidate again as it's an incumbent, if it doesn't meet the fundraising criteria of $500,000, then it could open up its challenge and go into a nomination, right? And then have and possibly lose the nomination and not be the candidate. So there is a deadline for Labor Day, and they're saying that the rules are far. It's the timeline is not able to be met, and the rules are part of a broader effort by the party to strengthen local riding organizations. So having, their liberal riding organizations that are able to get fundraising, that are able to get volunteers, and to have a really good grassroots team to be able to improve fundraising capacity, and then to ensure that these MPs, remain engaged grassroots within their own constituents, right? If they're doing a lot of, if they're ministers, they're probably away from their constituencies. And so that's the other thing. So now the next federal election is not scheduled until 2030, but we know that the prime minister could trigger an election anytime because he's the prime minister, right? Before, when he had a minority government, then you needed to have, the other parties in parliament to trigger an election because there's a loss of confidence. But now he's secure from that. So now he can pull an election if he wants this fall. And perhaps that's part of the criteria of, why they need to be able to meet these deadlines. So it's very interesting to see this take place, and the caucus essentially push back on some of these things that are happening right now. Now, President Trump has, he's come up with a very novel idea of what he's pushing, and perhaps maybe this is something that other countries will do. President Trump is now saying that he wants to allow the United States government to take equity stakes in major AI companies, potentially giving taxpayers a direct share in the profits of the AI revolution. You know, I've been discussing this internally, right? Because, you have Prime Minister Mark Carney just announced $2.3 billion on just initiatives for AI, right? Whether it's for data centers, training, then he's made announcements of doubling our electrical grid to be able to support data centers. That's all taxpayer dollars. That's when the government says we're going to spend X amount, that's taxpayer dollars. That's you going to work hard and then, paying your income taxes, paying other taxes, and all that goes to the government, and, business tax, and all the other tax criterias. And then the government takes all those tax dollars, which it should definitely review before it decides to spend in committee, but then you have them deciding on how to spend it. So at a time when you have the CEO of OpenAI, right, Sam Altman, say you need to have universal basic income, there's going to be lots of jobs gone. Yes, it's going to create opportunities, but there's going to be lots of jobs gone, right? What's universal basic income? That means the government gives a few $1,000s, let's say $2,000, for people who've lost their jobs, and that's their income from the government. Where does that government get the income from if they lose tax revenues from working people? Does it then tax the AI companies because now they have created this, innovation that, creates job losses? Yes, it creates efficiencies and so many other great things, but then the previous jobs are gone. So now it's interesting because when you have the head of these massive companies like Entropy saying, we're going to stop doing our developments on AI if everybody else agrees, because what's to come for humanity is going to be something we haven't measured and to be able to be fully aware of. Or when you have OpenAI, another $1 trillion company, saying, you know, we need to have universal basic income. You have Jeff Bezos, you know, who has other AI companies saying there should be no income tax for a certain bracket. And you have Elon Musk, who's publicly talked about against superintelligence and what it means for humanity. So now President Trump is doing something interesting here. He's saying, I want a stake. I want because he realizes if people lose their jobs, there's no income coming into the government. So where do you get that income from? You get it by being a stakeholder at these AI companies that are, valued at trillions of dollars. With so many startups valued so high just because they're an AI company. And that's why some people question, is there an AI bubble like the dot-com bubble back in the 90s, if you recall? So this is interesting because President Trump is saying that Americans should be partners in the AI revolution. So meaning if the government has a share of a stake in these AI companies and then gets the revenues in, then it can spend on the bridges, infrastructure, all the other spendings that the government has to do for people. And that is why he's saying, because the government is for the people, saying that's how you can have partners. You have Americans become the partners in this AI revolution, not being left behind, but become a partner of. Very interesting proposal he's put out there. I think it's very interesting to see how Canada is going to take on this and review this. You have OpenAI, Anthropic, that could eventually reach trillion-dollar valuations, a 2% stake in a $3 trillion AI company would be worth approximately $60 billion in revenues for the federal government, right? So this proposal differs from Senator Bernie Sanders' idea of 50% stock tax on major AI firms to fund public wealth funds. But this is a conversation we need to have in Canada about what is the strategy for Canadians, because we're hearing all this AI investment, but okay, you're investing in AI infrastructure and capabilities by using Canadian taxpayer dollars. So what is going to happen to the Canadians that are just not going to be, able to keep up with this AI revolution, right? And so very interesting times to take a look at because this AI boom is driving unprecedented wave of data centers, constructions across North America and globally. Some of the stats there are that 175 new data center permits were issued in 2025, one of the highest annual total sense permits record since 1976. This is so we're right now we have data on 1,400 data centers built, approved, and under construction, right? And from that, what we're seeing out of these 1,400 facilities that are being built, approved, and under construction, we're seeing that electricity demand would be roughly 50% higher than facilities permitting that previous years. That's why the prime minister is saying we're going to double our electrical grids by 50%. That's why like all of the agenda and all the spending that we're hearing about is because of these stats that they're looking at. And so this is a time where you have a lot of communities saying we don't want these data centers in our communities because we don't know what the environmental risks are. We don't know what our health risks are. It's taking our electricity. It needs a lot of water to cool down these data centers. And these data centers are a way for the average person to lose their job if they're not able to be job placed elsewhere. Because this AI race is massive. It's changing constantly. And yes, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be left out in terms of skill set and in terms of positions. So it's going to be very interesting to see what Canada is going to do about it. We're going to take a quick break and we're going to be right back.